It's time to have a Terrel Bernard conversation. Who is he? What has he done? And what does the future look like? We're breaking that down for you today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, folks, welcome in. Very excited for today's conversation, which is all about Bills linebacker Terrel Bernard. And my objective is to paint a picture. Terrel Bernard, one of the bright young players on the Buffalo Bills roster that appears that he's going to be a fixture for this team for a long time to come. And so I really want to get you acquainted with him, and we'll talk about who he is, what he's done, what the film says, the concerns, the possibility of an extension, all of that. We'll break it all down for you here today. And I've done this for several players throughout the last several years. This offseason, we've done James Cook, Khalil Shakir, and Christian Benford. In the past, I've done Spencer Brown and Levi Wallace, Tremaine Edmunds, AJ Epinesa, Boogie Basham, Ed Oliver, Dawson Knox. But today is Terrel Bernard's turn in the spotlight. So let's do it. Of course, a 2022 third-round pick of the Buffalo Bills, pick number 89 overall. And I want to stop right there and kind of elaborate on the Bills' decision to draft Terrel Bernard. It was an interesting time because Tremaine Edmunds was entering a contract year. Matt Milano had several years left on his contract. And the concern was, can the Bills keep Tremaine Edmunds? Should they keep Tremaine Edmunds? Is he the type of player they should let walk? A lot of dynamics there. And so you thought maybe in that draft they could get ahead of the need and draft a linebacker that could be the successor to Tremaine Edmunds. And when the pick was Terrel Bernard, I was very confused. And my initial reaction to the Terrel Bernard pick was not very favorable. I thought Terrel Bernard was far more of a Matt Milano type player that would replace Milano than somebody that could step in and be a Mike linebacker and replace Tremaine Edmunds. And then you got some new information about a year later from Bobby Babich, who's now the Bills defensive coordinator. He was the linebackers coach at the time, from Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott, where they all discussed that their goal was to have two matchup linebackers and that they were transitioning away from having a traditional Mike linebacker like Tremaine Edmunds. They wanted basically two Matt Milanos. And I'll say this, it'd have been nice to know that at the time, because I wouldn't have been critical of the pick at all, because I would have understood the vision. When you draft Terrel Bernard and in your mind you're thinking, oh, wow, this is your player to replace Tremaine Edmunds, you can understand why there's very different skill sets involved and how that didn't make a lot of sense to me. But if you are evolving your scheme to include two matchup linebackers, all right, well, this now does make sense. I wanted to kind of explain my initial reaction to the Terrel Bernard selection and why it didn't make sense to me. But anyways, the number 89 pick, third round, 2022 out of Baylor. He's currently 25 years old, and he actually just turned 25 back in May. So this is his true age 25 season. He's a native of LaPorte, Texas. Growing up, he was one of 6 children as part of his family, played a bunch of different sports growing up, but in high school, football became his primary focus, and he actually made the varsity team as a freshman, and his career in high school really took off. As a sophomore and a junior, he was a first-team all-district selection, and then as a senior, he was the district MVP and second-team all-state in Texas, right? Football, high school football is big in Texas, and did all that as a senior while also playing some running back. Actually had 10 rushing touchdowns for his career in high school, in addition to being a standout linebacker. So he was a 3-star recruit, had a bunch of different offers, teams in the mix: Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Northwestern, and Texas Tech. He actually originally committed to Houston, but he flipped that to Baylor when Matt Rule was hired to be the head coach at Baylor, and he's very accomplished in the classroom. He has a degree in health, kinesiology, and leisure studies, and also has his master's in sports management. Was a very good college player, 31 starts, appeared in 45 games, a ton of production, 317 tackles, 31 and a half tackles for loss, 16 and a half sacks, 12 pass breakups, and 3 interceptions. He was an all-conference selection for the Big 12 all 3 years that he was a starter, was a team captain as a senior, and the MVP of the Sugar Bowl in his final game. Going to the NFL scouting combine, he checked in at 6'1", 224 pounds. It's interesting because he was 220 at the Senior Bowl. He was 218 at his pro day, and his pro day is where he ran his 40-yard dash. And so he's a lean linebacker, right? This isn't a guy that's going to be confused as, a 240, 250-pound thumper, right? He's going to be, his playing weight, I'm guessing, is around 220, 225. And, that's just today's NFL. Linebackers are a little bit smaller. The only team that's out there using these 250-pound linebackers is really the Patriots, right? They run a very specific type of defense. But Terrel Bernard, probably around 200 to 225 pounds. He's got short arms, 30.25-inch arms. That's the second percentile. So not a lot of length in terms of anatomical length. 9 5/8-inch hands. That's the 51 percentile. And his relative athleticism score is an 8.88, which is very good. A perfect score is a 10. And so that's definitely an above average grade. So a little bit of a smaller linebacker in terms of mass and length. Very good athlete. So far in the NFL, this is obviously his third season. So he's played 2 seasons to this point. 2022 as a rookie, he appeared in 16 games with 1 start during the regular season. The 1 start came against the Jets in place of Tremaine Edmunds, and it was a pretty underwhelming performance. And what's interesting is Brandon Beane has since talked about Terrel Bernard's rookie season and that performance in particular, and a lesson that they learned. And they trained Terrel Bernard from day one to play both linebacker spots, the Mike linebacker spot and the Will linebacker spot in the defense. And when Brandon Beane talked about that, he said maybe that was a bit of a mistake, putting so much on the plate of a young player right away, and perhaps that didn't position him to showcase himself at his best in his first start against the Jets. And they talked about how they corrected that with Dorian Williams, where they tried Dorian Williams as a Mike linebacker, then they tried him as a weak side linebacker, and then really just focused on weak side linebacker for the rest of his rookie season after kind of sampling him at both spots. And, there's just differences between the 2 spots in the defense. And we'll see how that evolves moving forward with other linebackers. We'll see how that impacts the development of Dorian Williams. But it's interesting that Brandon Beane referred to a conversation that he had with Terrel Bernard about that opportunity as a rookie, and maybe there's just a lot on the plate of these guys mentally as they adjust to the NFL, having to play and learn both spots. So he had the 1 start, was a 4-phase special teams player all year, was actually second on the Bills in special teams tackles as a rookie, just 1 behind Saron Neal for the team lead. Fast forward to 2023, and this is where things really took off. And it was pretty surprising because the concerns last offseason were right tackle and Mike linebacker, and both of those things turned out to be just fine. Where at Mike linebacker, Tremaine Edmunds was a free agent. He left for a massive contract with the Chicago Bears that I don't blame the Bills for not matching. But then they really didn't do much to replace Tremaine Edmunds that offseason. It was a competition between Terrel Bernard as a third-round pick and Tyrel Dodson, who was an undrafted free agent that has been around for a while, but really hadn't played much. And then I guess you had Baylon Spector in the mix, kind of, and then a rookie in Dorian Williams. And so you go through training camp and felt like every other day Terrel Bernard and Tyrel Dodson took turns running the first team unit in practice. But then Terrel Bernard has a hamstring injury during training camp that keeps him out of the entire preseason. And so you feel like Tyrel Dodson's handed this job, but then even through rehabbing from the hamstring injury, Terrel Bernard's still your week 1, day 1 starter for the 2023 season. And any concerns about his capacity to replace Tremaine Edmunds was erased very quickly, right? You kind of knew pretty soon in that rookie season that Terrel Bernard looked good, and you were just hoping that the wheels never fell off, and they didn't. And they didn't fall off despite not having Daquan Jones after week 5 for like a huge stretch of the season, not having his running mate, Matt Milano, for every game after the Jaguars game. And so I think that's one of the most impressive things about Terrel Bernard's rookie season, in my opinion. It's just how much of an impact playmaker he was through all the shifting pieces around him when it comes to his running mate, Milano, even players up front that had injuries. Of course, Daquan Jones, the headliner there. And then even behind him where, Micah Hyde had some injuries, Jordan Poyer had some injuries, you're mixing in Taylor Rapp. There were some tough circumstances on that defense, but Terrel Bernard's impact remained very consistent throughout the course of the season. Real quick, I'll give you his numbers, and then we'll start talking about the film. 17 regular season games. Terrel Bernard, 143 tackles. That's 12th most in the NFL last year. 10 tackles for loss. That's 13th among off-ball linebackers. Had 8 sacks. I know that the traditional box scores would tell you 6.5, but I like to kind of look at Pro Football Focus and how they score sacks, because they count all sacks as full sacks, no half sacks. And so if you look at it through that lens, number 1 in terms of off-ball linebackers, 3 fumble recoveries, second most among off-ball linebackers, 3 interceptions, second most among all off-ball linebackers, and 5 pass breakups. Terrel Bernard filled up the stat sheet with splash plays, right? Impact tackles for loss, QB hits, fumble recoveries, interceptions, making plays on the ball. He did it all in his first season as a starter. So career is taking off in a big way, and we're all excited to see what he's going to do in his third season. And on the other side of it, I really want to talk about the film. I spent some time watching his film in advance of recording this podcast, and I want to share what spoke to me the most. So we'll do that here on the other side of it, so be sure to stick with me. There's nothing quite like being at the ballpark, taking in a Major League Baseball game during the summer. Well, if you want to do that, you got to download the Game Time app. Game Time is an authorized ticket place of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. They have killer deals on last-minute tickets, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. So snag the tickets without the stress. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, let's talk about the film and what the film revealed to me. I've obviously watched it all throughout the course of the season, but I wanted to look at it specifically through the lens of Terrel Bernard. And so before recording this podcast, I went back and watched the first Miami game, the Kansas City game from the regular season, Philly and Dallas from 2023, to just really get myself acquainted with who Terrel Bernard is as a football player. And I want to discuss this through the lens of the 9 different traits that I evaluate linebackers through. I have a pretty, straightforward system for how I evaluate football players. And every position has different traits that I assess and score to grade a player. And for linebackers, I grade them through the following 9 traits: football IQ, coverage ability, lateral mobility, block deconstruction, run defense, tackling, competitive toughness, leadership, and versatility. So I'm going to discuss what I saw from Terrel Bernard in each one of those categories. So I do also want to point this out. The reason I picked that first Miami game was I wanted to give myself one exposure to Bernard with the healthy Daquan Jones and with a healthy Matt Milano with a few games under their belt. So this was their 4th game together. And one thing that it inspired was a lot of excitement for me to see Milano and Bernard play together for an entire season. You know, Matt Milano's such a good football player. It was fun to go back and watch him and see how aggressive he is, how he runs, how he flies around, how instinctive he is. And I thought you saw plenty of examples in that game tape of how they can play off of each other. And, you know, even at times where maybe one guy took an aggressive angle to get to the ball, you could see the other guy kind of felt that and put themselves in a good position to kind of clean things up. They were playing off each other quite well, even with some of the coverage exchanges, sometimes with some of the pressure looks that Sean McDermott would tap into to kind of send these guys at the pocket. They played off each other quite well, and I think that will only improve with time and more reps together. So that's one of the most exciting things for me about this Bills defense in 2024. All right, so let's talk about these traits. Football IQ. I think this stands out when you watch Terrel Bernard. I think he's a very instinctive, fast-to-flow player, understands his keys, diagnoses, and triggers very, very quickly. You don't see a lot of tardy responses, sees the action, feels the action, and puts himself in strong positions to get to the football. And I think that is both against the run and the pass. I think he's a very instinctive football player. I think anybody that watches Terrel Bernard would come away with that impression. In coverage, Terrel Bernard gives you a lot here. He's a player that I trust in man coverage. I think he's got the athleticism and instincts to carry routes down the field in man, which is important, right? Because he's going to have to be in the middle of the field. There's times he's going to have to carry a tight end down the seam. There's time he's going to have to carry running backs down the field, and, you know, even getting depth and having to carry an over route from the slot. So I like that he can do that, but also he's probably even better in zone coverage, where just a very, very, very sound feel for sensing what's happening behind him, reading the backfield, and leveraging routes, right? That's what zone coverage is really about from that middle linebacker position. Can you read the backfield? Can you feel things happening behind you? Can you feel those in-breaking routes? Can you feel those routes getting more depth and put yourself in positions to stay leveraged and take throws off the menu? And then when they do challenge you, can you make a play on the ball? I think all of that is an emphatic yes for Terrel Bernard. So an instinctive player that thrives in coverage, and that's very important. I think coverage ability from linebackers is so critical. And that's a big evolution for the NFL and that position in particular. And I think Terrel Bernard falls right in line with the modern trends of a middle linebacker. Next up is lateral mobility. I think that Terrel Bernard has very good change of direction skill. I think he flows to the football extremely well laterally. I don't see restrictions in terms of tightness in his hips or tightness in his ankles with his ability to flip his hips and pivot and hinge and turn. I think he can work sideline to sideline at a high level. Block deconstruction. I think this is an area of his game that I wouldn't call it a big time strength, but for an undersized linebacker that's, you know, around 220 pounds, that has very short arms, his ability to deconstruct blocks is pretty impressive. There are plenty of times, particularly against Miami and Kansas City, where Joe Thuney is coming down on him and has to take an angle to cut him off, or even Robert Hunt. And you could see Terrel Bernard feel that and just get his hands on quick, right? He knows that he can't take him head on, right? He's 100 pounds less than those guys. You know, he's not going to be able to take those guys head on. But his ability to stun and quickly punch and get his hands on a guy and then allow that momentum to kind of take him to the football is really, really strong. And so I think he does a good job of using his hands, trying to be stout, And when he could pick a side and be right, he's very good at working through blocks. Now, the challenge is that if he's having to take blocks head on and plug guys back into holes and really stack and shed, right? That's going to be a tough challenge for Terrel Bernard at 200, low 220 pounds, short arms, right? There's just not a lot that he has going for him to be able to physically win in those situations. So he has to win with technique. He has to win with athleticism, and he does a lot, but make no mistake about it, there are instances where, he kind of gets swallowed up because, well, it's tough to take on guys that are 100, 120 pounds more than you and be able to remain stout. So he's got to pick a side a lot of times, which can get him in trouble because, you gotta fill your gap. And if you take on that, you pick the side of the block with the wrong leverage, well, then you're not going to be in position to make a play. So I think there's some give and take with a smaller or an undersized linebacker. And I think some of the give shows up in how he can take on blocks. Although I think there are some very good moments in that ability to be instinctive, athletic, getting ahead of blocks, winning with technique. It definitely shows up. But if he's got to take them head on, it's not always a pretty sight. In terms of run defense, I think Terrel Bernard, when he sees it and he triggers and he goes, man, he makes some really, really dynamic plays. I think he feels the run game well. I thought there was a lot of instances where he was able to kind of play peekaboo with the running backs and play behind the D-line and really just show that ability to spring and move laterally and get to the football. I think he's very good at stringing out those wide zone runs. That really pops on tape. I think there's going to be instances, though, when, if everything's coming right at him and it's just a matter of, hey, I got to out-muscle you and get off a block, I don't think that's going to be his best moments. I think when he can kind of work in at an angle laterally is kind of his best moments defending the run. Tackling, I think this is an area that Terrel Bernard can get better at. He's got a very high missed tackle rate, 15.6% missed tackle rate. That's seventh highest among off-ball linebackers in the NFL last year. Had 26 total missed tackles, which in terms of volume was second most last season. So I would like to see Terrel Bernard become a better tackler. I think this is where lack of mass, short arms, right? This can make it difficult to tackle, right? Because you don't have a lot of margin for error. Your radius is condensed, right? Because you don't have a ton of length that you offer. And, when you're pinballing off of players all the time, it can be hard to square up and be in good positions to consistently make a tackle. And so I think this is part of the give and take that you have, again, with the short-armed, leaner linebacker, is that there's some concessions with block deconstruction. There's concessions sometimes with tackling. And I think that's part of the deal. But I don't think he's a bad tackler. I think he can improve, but I just think there's going to be some physical limitations that you have to be mindful of there. Competitive toughness is the next category. Oh, man, no concerns here. Terrel Bernard is a urgent football player. His motor is always cranked. He's never shy of taking on contact. I mean, there's plenty of instances where you watch him firing downhill and taking on blocks against offensive linemen, like I said, that are 100 pounds more than him. There's never any hesitation. He flies around. He's physical. He plays way above his weight class. And zero concerns about competitive toughness at all. He's a big time. He's a dog, right? Like, he's got the dog in him. You've seen the x-ray pictures, whatever. He's got all that stuff. Leadership, I think that pops a lot for Terrel Bernard, team captain at Baylor. And I think he'll probably be a team captain for the Bills this year. I think it's a tough job to, in your second season, replace a Tremaine Edmunds, who was a 5-year starter, play alongside Matt Milano, veterans all over that defense, and Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer and Trey White, Von Miller, and you're the guy that steps in and is the signal caller for the defense. I thought he did that seamlessly. You listen to the way he talks, you could tell he loves football. He loves the role that he's in. I think he's going to be a guy that gets the C on his jersey and is revered as a team captain for a long time to come. The last category is versatility. I think that's one of my favorite things about Terrel Bernard is, while there's a lack of mass, there's a lack of length, there's not that much outside of that where you see limitations in terms of what he can do. Brings appeal on every down and situation. Outstanding blitzer, the guy that you can ask him to time it up and beat a block and take a good angle, and he does that at a high level. I think the run defense, he's instinctive, fast to flow, and like I said, while there are some limitations, I think he is a good run defender, and then in coverage, obviously, I think that's really one of his biggest strengths. So not much in the way of deficiencies that you think to yourself, wow, he doesn't have versatility. I think he's extremely versatile. So the guy checks a lot of boxes, right? There's a lot of appealing traits for him on film, and hopefully you were able to digest what I just went through and get a good feel for what he does on the field, and then where those areas are where it doesn't work out all the time, and that there's room for growth. On the other side of it, I want to talk about injuries. I think it's an important part of the Terrel Bernard conversation, the future, including his 2024 expectations and the contract, right? He's going to be extension eligible after this season. So I want to talk about those dynamics. So be sure to stick with me. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, we're focusing in on injuries and the future in this segment. And with Terrel Bernard, he does have a pretty lengthy injury history. And that's something to be mindful of. I say it a lot because I think it matters. Your best ability is your availability. You cannot impact football games from the sideline when you don't have a jersey because you're hurt. And, of course, we felt that with Terrel Bernard getting injured against the Steelers in the playoffs and then not being available for the Kansas City game. But let me give you this full injury history. We can't run from it. We can't hide from it. It's real. 2017, he had a right foot fracture that required season-ending injury. He missed 10 games. Played in 2 before the injury. 2018, he did miss 2 games late in the season. But we're not, that's kind of funky. There's been no injuries reported for that, but he did miss 2 games late in the year after playing the first 11. In 2019, had a broken right hand in November that required surgery. Didn't miss any games, but he did have a broken hand. 2020, he had a left shoulder injury that resulted in a dislocation, labrum tear, humeral avulsion of, I can't even say these words, but there's a lot, a glenoid fracture, season-ending injury. He played in 5 games and then missed the rest of the year with dislocated shoulder, labrum tear, all that stuff. 2021, he had a meniscus tear that required arthroscopic knee surgery. He missed a game due to that. 2022, it looks like he was clean. And then in 2023, he had the hamstring injury that cost him the entire preseason. And then he suffered against the Steelers an ankle subluxation. And according to Dr. Kyle Trimble of Banged Up Bills, that means it was a partial dislocation and that it popped in and out. He also had lateral and medial sprains. I mean, just a lot, right? It's all different, it feels like. I mean, you got a hand, a shoulder, a knee, hamstrings, a foot, right? Just like a lot of different things. And it's hard to say, well, he's going to be injured all the time or he's not. But going back throughout his meaningful football career and Baylor and the Bills, I mean, there's just been stuff. There's been stuff. And so a lot of it's significant. And so he's got to stay healthy. He's got to be available. And that's going to be an important part of the future for him. Because my expectations are high. Like when you think about what I'm expecting from Terrel Bernard in 2024, it's to once again be one of the most dynamic impact playmaking linebackers in the league. I think he showed us that ability in his first season as a starter with some unique circumstances around him. Now it's year 2. It's his role. He's the incumbent starter. He's playing back with Matt Milano. Daquan Jones is there. Like, he should be a very high impact playmaker in a in a year that he becomes contract extension eligible after. So I'm very excited for Terrel Bernard this year. I think he's going to be a team captain, and I think he's going to have a great season as long as he can stay healthy. And so that kind of gets us to the part of the conversation where I want to discuss what a contract extension looks like. And so let's assume that he's very much the player we saw in 2023, again in 2024, and maybe even takes a step. So let's get into this linebacker contract landscape. When you consider the top of the market, and I think that's important to do, you got Roquan Smith with the Ravens, 5 years, $100 million, $20 million AAV. Then you have Fred Warner of the 49ers, 5 years, $95.2 million, a tick over $19 million per season. Tremaine Edmunds is number 3, 4 years, $72 million, $18 million a season. And then fourth in terms of average per year is Matt Milano. 2 years, $28 million was the new money on his deal. That's an average annual value of $14.2 million. So that's the top of the market, those 4 guys. Then you get into Patrick Queen, who just signed with the Steelers, 3 years, $41 million. That's 13.6 AAV. And that makes him the 5th highest paid linebacker in the NFL. Azeez Al-Shaair just signed with Houston, 3 years, $34 million. That's a little over $11 million AAV. And then Zaire Franklin just re-upped with the Colts, 3 years, $31 million, 10.4 AAV. There's a lot of markets, positional markets that are booming in the NFL right now. I don't know that linebacker is one of them. I was nervous that it would explode after Tremaine Edmunds got 18. I think you kind of looked at Patrick Queen this past offseason as a guy that could challenge for that again, and he didn't get there, right? He only got to 13.6. I think the NFL is telling us that the Tremaine Edmunds deal was an overspend and that it doesn't really matter in the equation of linebacker contracts moving forward. And this happens from time to time where there is you just know there's a massive overspend. Everybody knows there's a massive overspend, and it's just not part of the equation. I think the CJ Mosley deal, the first one that he signed with the Jets, wasn't as influential in the linebacker market as it appeared at the time. And I think the same thing is true about Tremaine Edmunds. So you only have 9 linebackers in the NFL right now making north of $10 million a season. You've only got 4 that are making, or you really only have 3. You only have 3 that are making over $15 million a season. Salary cap keeps going up, all of that. I get it. But I think the reality is you haven't had these huge resets, and I don't think you're going to get a bunch of huge resets. Like the players that are due for contract extensions after this season, Terrel Bernard's on that list, but then it's like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah with the Browns, and I think that'll be a similar situation. Those contracts will come up very similar. Nick Bolton with the Chiefs, who I think will get much less than Terrel Bernard. Pete Warner with the Saints. Divine Diablo with the Raiders. That one will be interesting. Ernest Jones with the Rams. EJ Speed with the Colts. So it's not like I just said Fred Warner and Roquan Smith are coming up for contracts, right? It's younger players that I think are comparable in a lot of ways to Terrel Bernard in terms of their value and skill set and projection moving forward. So I don't think you're going to see this massive boom. But I still think that Terrel Bernard is positioning himself to get a pretty nice payday. I would project right now that his contract comes in 12, 13 million, maybe on the high end, 14 or 15. So put the range at like 12 to $15 million a season. And so he'll be handsomely paid, and I think he'll be one of the top 8 highest paid linebackers in the league when it's all said and done. But I think the timing is actually pretty good based on where the market sits and the players that are coming up for extensions and how that all works together to find a reasonable landing spot for Terrel Bernard. Now, I think the challenge is that, Matt Milano, I just talked about it. He's the 4th highest paid linebacker in the league in terms of APY. And now you're talking about Terrel Bernard being a top 8 paid linebacker. Are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with having 2 players at linebacker, which is generally viewed as a lower value position? Are you comfortable having that much tied up into 2 linebackers, which is very similar to the conversation we had with Tremaine Edmunds and Matt Milano, right? And the Bills said no to Edmunds. And I'm not sure that they said no to Edmunds at their dollar amount. I think that he got he assessed the market. He got a huge deal from the Bears, and Brandon Beane said, all the best, man. Congrats. Like, good luck. So I think they're willing, but it's fair to ask the question, well, do you really want to pay two linebackers, that type of money? Linebackers are important for this defense. I remember watching those Panthers defenses with Luke Kuechly and Thomas Davis and just being in awe of how impactful they were and how important they were for the defense and how aggressive they were with those guys. And I'm not going to say Milano and Bernard are that, because I think Luke Kuechly is the best linebacker I've watched in my lifetime. I'm not going to sit here and say that these guys are that, but I think you can draw some parallels and feel like the impact and importance could be somewhat similar. And so there's a lot to consider. I think that Terrel Bernard's going to be a fixture for this defense for a long time. I think he's going to get an extension, but I think those are all the dynamics that are in play when considering that proposition. All right, folks, there you have it. The Terrel Bernard podcast. I hope that after listening to this, you feel well acquainted with one of the key members of the Bills roster moving forward, a guy that I think is going to be an influential captain, influential playmaker, and you should be well acquainted with all the dynamics that exist within him assuming that role for this football team. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. I hope that you enjoyed. I hope that you come back. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.